The warning alarms screamed through the small reconnaissance pod as Lieutenant Hansel fought with the controls. Red lights flashed across his instruments while the ship shook violently. Outside the viewport, the green canopy of Verdania Prime rushed up to meet him at a dangerous speed. Come on, Hansel," whispered through gritted teeth. His hands moved quickly over the emergency controls, trying to slow his descent. The alien fighters had damaged his main engines during the surprise attack. Now he was falling toward a planet that was supposed to be empty of intelligent life. The pod crashed through the thick branches of enormous trees. Each impact sent sharp pain through Hansel's body as he was thrown against his restraints. Metal screamed against wood and stone. Finally, the pod came to rest against a massive boulder with a sound like thunder. For several minutes, Hansel could only breathe heavily and try to clear his vision. His head pounded and warm blood ran down his face from a cut on his forehead. When he tried to move his left leg, white-hot pain shot through his body. The bone was definitely broken. With great effort, Hansel managed to activate the pod's emergency beacon. The small device beeped weakly before going silent. Either the crash had damaged it or the thick forest canopy was blocking the signal. He was truly alone on this alien world. The pod's door had been twisted in the crash, but Hansel managed to force it open enough to crawl outside. The pain in his leg made him gasp, but he pushed through it. Survival training had taught him that staying in a crashed vehicle was often more dangerous than being in the open. The forest around him was unlike anything he had ever seen. The trees rose like green towers into the sky, their trunks so wide that 10 people holding hands could not wrap around them. Strange flowers glowed softly in the dim light that filtered through the leaves. The air smelled of earth and growing things, but there was something else too, something wild and alive. Hansel dragged himself away from the smoking wreckage of his pod. Every movement sent pain through his broken leg, but he forced himself to keep going, found a spot between 2 large roots where he could rest with his back against solid wood. From here, he could see the crash site and watch for any rescue ships that might come looking for him. As he sat there catching his breath, Hansel became aware that he was being watched. It was not a sound or movement that alerted him, but rather the feeling that comes when predator eyes are studying potential prey. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, and his hand moved instinctively to the small sidearm at his belt. At first, he saw nothing but shadows and green growth. Then, about 50 meters away, 2 points of amber light appeared in the darkness beneath a cluster of ferns. They were eyes, and they were watching him with the steady patience of a natural hunter. Hansel tried to remain perfectly still. In his training, he had learned that sudden movements could trigger an attack from wild animals. These eyes were too high off the ground to belong to any small creature. Whatever was watching him was large enough to be dangerous. The eyes moved slightly, and Hansel caught a glimpse of something that made his breath catch. The creature was huge, easily the size of an earth tiger, but its fur seemed to shimmer. With an inner light, crystalline patterns ran along what he could see of its body, catching and reflecting the dim forest light like living starlight. For long minutes they watched each other in silence. Hansel's heart hammered in his chest, but the creature made no move to approach. It simply observed him with what seemed like curiosity rather than hunger. This was not the behavior he expected from a predator. As the hours passed, the strange standoff continued. Hansel used his emergency medical kit to clean his wounds and fashion a crude splint for his broken leg. The pain was intense, but he worked steadily, knowing that infection could kill him just as surely as any predator. The creature never moved closer, but it never left either. Occasionally, Hansel would catch glimpses of it as it circled his position. The way it moved was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Each step was perfectly silent, each movement fluid and controlled. This was a master of its environment, a creature that had never known fear. When darkness began to fall, Hansel managed to gather enough dry wood to build a small fire. The flames pushed back the shadows and provided some warmth, but they also revealed his watcher more clearly. Creature was even more magnificent than he had imagined. Its fur was a deep silver blue color that shifted and changed in the firelight. The crystalline patterns he had glimpsed earlier covered its entire body, creating a natural armor that looked both beautiful and deadly. Its head was broad and powerful, with ears that twitched at every sound. But it was the eyes that held Hansal's attention. They were intelligent eyes, filled with awareness that seemed almost human. "Hello there," Hansal said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not here to hurt you or take anything from your home. I'm just lost and hurt." The creature's ears perked up at the sound of his voice, but it made no other response. It simply continued to watch him with those remarkable amber eyes. As the night deepened, Hansal found himself talking to his silent companion. He told it about his mission, about the attack that had brought him down, about his fears of dying alone so far from home. The creature listened to everything, never moving, but somehow conveying a sense of attention and understanding. "You know," Hansal said as he fed another piece of wood to the fire, "back on Earth, we have stories about animals that help lost travelers. I always thought they were just fairy tales." He looked across the flames at the glowing eyes. "Maybe I was wrong." The creature remained motionless, but something in its posture suggested it was considering his words. Hansal had the strange feeling that this meeting was as unusual for the creature as it was for him. Perhaps it had never seen a human before. Perhaps it was trying to understand what kind of being he was, as exhaustion finally began to claim him. Hansal felt oddly comforted by the presence of his mysterious guardian. Whatever this creature was, it had had many chances to attack him during the day. Instead, it had chosen to simply watch and wait. That choice gave him hope that he might survive long enough to be rescued. The last thing Hansal saw before sleep took him was the steady glow of amber eyes in the darkness, watching over him like a guardian angel with fangs and claws. The morning sun filtered through the forest canopy in golden beams as Hansal woke to the sound of his own groaning. His broken leg throbbed with each heartbeat, and his body ached from sleeping on the hard ground. The fire had burned down to cold ashes during the night, but he was still alive. That was more than he had expected when he first crashed. The amber eyes were still there, watching him from the shadows. The creature had not moved from its position during the night, as far as Hansal could tell. It had sat like a statue among the ferns, patient and alert. In the morning light, Hansal could see more details of his mysterious guardian. The creature was definitely feline, but larger than any cat that had ever lived on Earth. Its shoulders stood almost as high as Hansal's. Chest would, if he were standing. The crystalline patterns in its fur caught the sunlight and threw tiny rainbows across the forest floor. Despite its size and obvious strength, there was something graceful about the way it held itself. This was a creature that belonged in this wild place. Han-Soul struggled to sit up, biting back a cry of pain as his broken leg shifted. The creature's ears twitched at the sound, but it made no move to come closer. It simply continued its endless vigil. "Still here, are you?" Hansal said softly. "I'm starting to think you might actually be trying to help me." The creature's head tilted slightly at the sound of his voice, but it gave no other response. Had the strange feeling that it understood more than it was letting on. Those intelligent eyes seemed to take in every detail of his movements and expressions. Hansal spent the morning working on his survival. He used branches and strips of cloth, from his uniform to improve the splint on his leg. The pain was terrible, but he forced himself to do the work properly. A badly healed bone would cripple him for life, assuming he lived long enough for it to matter. While he worked, small forest creatures began to approach his camp. Tiny animals that looked like a cross between squirrels and hummingbirds chittered at him from the trees. Something that resembled a rabbit but had 6 legs and blue fur hopped cautiously closer to investigate. Hansal watched these creatures with fascination. They were clearly curious about him, but they were also hungry. He could see it in the way they looked at his emergency food supplies. Without really thinking about it, Hansal broke off small pieces of his protein bars and scattered them on the ground. The small animals pounced on the food gratefully. Soon word seemed to spread through the forest, and more creatures appeared. Hansal found himself surrounded by a menagerie of alien life forms, all hoping for a share of his supplies. From her hiding place in the shadows, The great feline watched this display with growing interest. In her world, injured animals were either helped by their own kind or left to die. They did not share precious resources with creatures outside their species. This behavior was new to her, and she found it puzzling. As the day progressed, Hansel continued to surprise his silent observer. When he found a small bird-like creature with a broken wing, he spent an hour carefully splinting it with twigs and thread from his survival kit. The tiny animal seemed to understand that he was trying to help, and it held still while he worked. "There you go, little one," Hansel said as he finished the delicate operation. "I should heal up nicely if you take care of it." The creature watched from the shadows as Hansel gently placed the injured bird in a protected spot among the roots. The human had used his own precious medical supplies to help an animal that could give him nothing in return. This was behavior that the great feline had never seen before in any species. Later that afternoon, Hansel began working on a signal device. He had salvaged some electronic components from his crashed pod, and he was trying to build a transmitter that might reach his rescue ship. The work was difficult with his injured hands, but he persisted with the same patience he had shown the small animals. The creature watched him work with fascination. The human's hands were small and soft compared to her powerful claws, but they moved with incredible precision. She had never seen tools used with such skill before. In her world, problems were solved with strength and speed. This human solved problems with cleverness and determination. As evening approached, a new danger appeared. The scent reached the creature's sensitive nose long before Hansel noticed anything wrong. Thorn wolves were approaching. These pack hunters were among the most dangerous predators in the forest, and they had caught the scent of blood and weakness. The great feline tensed, ready to flee to safety in the trees. She had no reason to risk her life for a strange creature from another world, but then she paused and looked at Hansel, who was still working on his signal device, unaware of the approaching danger. The first thorn wolf appeared at the edge of the clearing just as the sun was setting. It was a massive beast with gray fur and spikes along its back. Its eyes glowed red in the dim light, and saliva dripped from its fangs. More shapes moved in the shadows behind it. The pack had found what they thought was easy prey. Hansel looked up from his work and saw the predator. Fear shot through him like ice water, but he did not panic. Instead, he quickly assessed the situation and began to act. He grabbed burning branches from his fire and threw them at the approaching wolves. The flames made them hesitate, but they did not retreat, moving as quickly as his injured leg would allow. Hansel began banging metal pieces together to create loud noise. The sound echoed through the forest, harsh and unnatural. The thorn wolf snarled and backed away slightly. Confused by this behavior, the hidden creature watched in amazement as Hansel continued his defense. The human was clearly terrified, but he was not giving up. He used every tool available to him, creating barriers of fire and noise to drive off the pack. Most impressive of all, he was doing it without trying to kill any of the wolves. The great feline had expected the human to use his strange weapons to fight the pack. Instead, Hansel was trying to scare them away without harming them. Even when facing death, this strange being was trying to avoid taking life. For over an hour, the battle continued. Hansel kept the wolves at bay with his clever tactics, but he was growing tired. His injured body could not keep up this effort much longer. The pack seemed to sense his weakness and began to press closer. Just when it seemed the wolves would overwhelm him, Hansel did something that changed everything. He began to sing. His voice was hoarse and weak, but he sang an old earth song about home and family. The melody was strange and beautiful. Unlike anything the forest had ever heard, the thorn wolves stopped their advance, confused by this new behavior. The great feline felt something stir in her chest as she listened to the human's song. There was sadness in it, but also hope. This creature was facing death, but he was not giving up. He was celebrating life even in his darkest moment. Finally, the wolves decided that this strange prey was too much trouble. They melted back into the darkness, leaving Hansel alone with his song and his mysterious guardian. The human collapsed beside his fire, exhausted but alive. The great feline remained in the shadows, but something had changed in her heart. This human was different from any creature she had ever known. He showed kindness to the weak, cleverness. In the face of danger and courage, when death seemed certain, these were qualities that demanded respect, even from a predator. As Hansel fell asleep beside his dying fire, the creature moved closer to his camp. She would continue to watch over this strange being. Something told her that his story was far from over. The third morning brought no sunrise for Hansel. He woke to a world that seemed dim and hazy, as if someone had placed a gray filter over his eyes. His broken leg had swollen to twice its normal size, and angry red lines of infection were spreading up from the wound. The fever that had been building for 2 days now burned through his body like fire. The great feline sensed the change immediately. The scent of sickness hung heavy in the air around the human's camp. She had moved closer during the night now. Resting only 20 meters away from where Hansel lay, shivering beside the cold ashes of his fire, Hansel tried to sit up. His strength was gone. The simple act of lifting his head made the world spin around him. He fumbled for his water bottle with shaking hands, but even drinking was difficult. The fever was winning the battle against his body. "This is not good," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible. "This is very not good." The creature's ears twitched at the sound of his weak voice. She had been watching him grow sicker over the past day, and now she could see that he was losing the fight. In the wild, this was when the weak were abandoned by their pack. But this human had no pack. He was completely alone. As the morning wore on, Hansel's condition grew worse. The fever broke down the walls he had built around his private thoughts, and he began to speak aloud about things he had never told anyone. The words poured out of him in a mixture of delirium and desperate need for connection. "So young," he said, staring up at the canopy above. "My little sister, eh? She must be so worried. I promised I would come back from this mission. I promised her I would be careful." Shh. The creature listened to every word, even though she could not understand their meaning. But she could hear the pain in his voice, the love and regret that colored every syllable. This was the sound of a being who cared deeply for others, even when facing his own death. "She wanted to be a doctor," Hansel continued, his voice growing weaker. "Said she wanted to help people the way I helped her. When our parents died, I should have told her how proud I was. I should have said so many things." Tears ran down Hansel's face as he spoke. The fever was stripping away all his defenses, leaving only the raw emotions beneath. The creature had never seen an adult of any species cry before. In her world, showing such vulnerability was a sign of weakness that would bring predators running. But somehow, this human's tears did not seem weak. They seemed honest and real. "I don't want to die here," Hansel whispered. I don't want to die alone. But I guess that's what happens when you're stupid enough to get shot down over an empty planet." The creature's heart stirred at these words. She understood loneliness. She understood the fear of dying without others of your kind nearby. These were feelings that crossed the boundaries between species. For the first time, she began to see the human not as a strange alien, but as a fellow being who was suffering. As the day progressed, Hansel's fever grew worse. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes speaking to people who were not there, sometimes lying silent and still. The creature watched it all with growing distress. She had seen many animals die in the forest, but this felt different. This felt wrong. By afternoon, the scavengers began to arrive. They could smell the approaching death from kilometers away. First came the carrion beetles, their black shells gleaming as they scuttled through the underbrush. Then came the bone. Birds, circling overhead with their harsh cries. Finally, the decay worms began to emerge from the soil, drawn by the promise of an easy meal. The creature watched the gathering scavengers with growing anger. In the natural order of things, they had every right to be here. When something died in the forest, they cleaned up the remains. But Hansel was not dead yet. He was still fighting, still breathing, still dreaming of home and family. The first carrion beetle reached the edge of Hansel's camp just as the sun was setting. It was the size of a dinner plate, with sharp mandibles and hungry eyes. It approached the unconscious human slowly, testing the air with its antennae. Behind it, more beetles emerged from the shadows. The creature felt something she had never experienced before. It was a hot, fierce emotion that made her muscles tense and her claws extend. She recognized it as protectiveness, but she had never felt it for anything outside her own species. The human had done nothing for her except share his food with small animals and sing strange songs, yet somehow she could not bear to watch him be eaten alive. The carrion beetle reached Hansal's outstretched hand and opened its mandibles to take a bite. That was when the creature made her choice. She exploded from the shadows like a silver comet, her massive form covering the distance to Hansal's camp in 3 powerful bounds. The carrion beetle barely had time to register her presence before she swatted it away with one huge paw. The impact sent it flying 20 meters into the trees. The other scavengers froze as the great feline positioned herself over Hansal's unconscious form. She had never been this close to the human before. She could feel the heat of his fever against her belly, could hear the shallow rasp of his breathing. He was so small and fragile compared to her, yet he had shown more courage than many of the predators she knew. She raised her head and let out a roar that shook the very trees. It was a sound of pure dominance, a declaration that this place and this being were now under her protection. The scavengers scattered in all directions, their instincts overriding their hunger. Nothing in the forest was foolish enough to challenge a creature of her size and power. When the echoes of her roar faded, the creature looked down at Hansal's peaceful face. The human was still unconscious, unaware that his life had just been saved. She could leave now. She had driven off the immediate threat, and her conscience was clear. But as she looked at his fevered features, she realized that driving away the scavengers was not enough. Hansal was dying. The infection was spreading through his body like poison, and his fever was burning away his strength. Even if no scavengers came, he would be dead by morning. The only chance he had was to reach the human settlement she had observed on the far side of the forest. But that was 3 days away, and he could not even stand. The creature had never carried anything except her own cubs. Her instincts told her to abandon this alien being and return to her own territory. But those same instincts had never prepared her for someone like Hansal. He had shown her that strength could be gentle, that intelligence could be kind, and that courage could exist without cruelty. She bent down and carefully positioned herself beside the unconscious human. Her powerful muscles tensed as she prepared to lift him onto her back. She had no idea if this would work, no idea if she could carry him all the way to safety. But she knew she had to try. The moment she lifted Hansal onto her back, the creature felt the full weight of her choice, which was now responsible for the life of a being from another world. If she failed, he would die. If she succeeded, she would have to carry him through 3 days of dangerous terrain without rest. But as she felt his weak heartbeat against her back, she knew there was no other choice she could make. This human had earned her respect through his actions, and now she would earn his trust through hers. The great feline began to walk toward the distant human settlement, carrying her precious cargo into the unknown. The first night of the journey was the hardest. The creature had never carried anything heavier than her own cubs, and Hansal was nearly as large as she was. His unconscious body was a dead weight on her back, and she had to constantly adjust her gait to keep him from sliding off. The fever made Hansal mumble and shift in his sleep, sometimes crying out in languages the creature did not understand. She could feel the heat of his sickness through her fur, and she knew that time was running out. Every hour that passed made his breathing weaker and his heartbeat more irregular. The creature pushed through the darkness, her powerful legs carrying them over fallen logs and through thick undergrowth. Her night vision was perfect, but the terrain was treacherous. One wrong step could send them both tumbling into a ravine or into the territory of something hungry and hostile. When dawn broke, they had covered a third of the distance to the human settlement. The creature's legs ached, and her paws were sore from the rocky ground, but she did not stop. She found a stream and carefully positioned herself so that Hansal could drink without falling off her back. The cool water seemed to help him slightly, and his fever broke for a few minutes. "Where am I?" Hansal whispered. his eyes opening for the first time in hours. The creature felt his consciousness return and stopped moving. She could not speak to him, but she remained perfectly still so he would not be frightened. Hansel lifted his head slightly and saw the forest moving past them. It took him several moments to understand what was happening. He said in wonder, "You're actually carrying me." The creature's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. There was amazement in his tone, but also gratitude. Hansel's weak hand reached down to touch her neck, and she felt the gentle pressure of his fingers against her fur. "Thank you," he whispered. "I don't know why you're doing this, but thank you." The fever took him again after that, and he slipped back into unconsciousness. But the creature had heard the gratitude in his voice, and it gave her strength to continue. She began moving again, her pace steady and determined. The second day brought new challenges. They had to cross a river that was running high from recent rains. The creature was an excellent swimmer, but carrying Hansel made everything more difficult. She entered the water slowly, feeling the current try to sweep them downstream. Halfway across, Hansel began to slip. The water had made her fur slippery, and his unconscious body was sliding toward the rushing current. The creature had to make a choice between speed and safety. She chose safety, taking slow, careful steps even as the cold water rose around. Then, by the time they reached the other side, both of them were soaked and shivering. The creature shook herself dry as best she could, then found a sunny spot where they could rest. She positioned Hansel so that the warm sunlight would help dry his clothes and warm his body. While they rested, the creature became aware that they were being followed. A pack of shadow stalkers had picked up their scent and were tracking them. Through the forest, these predators were smaller than the creature, but they were cunning and they hunted in groups. They would not attack her directly, but they would wait for her to show weakness. The creature knew she could not fight a pack while carrying Hansel. Her only option was to outrun them. She lifted her precious burden and began to move faster, her powerful legs eating up the distance. Behind them, she could hear the shadow stalkers keeping pace, waiting for their chance. The chase continued for hours. The creature's lungs burned with effort, and her legs trembled with exhaustion. But she did not slow down. Hansel's life depended on her strength, and she would not let him down. Finally, they entered a section of the forest where the trees grew so close together that the shadow stalkers could not follow. The creature had to squeeze through gaps between the massive trunks, being careful not to scrape Hansel against the bark. It was slow going, but it was safe. When they emerged from the tree maze, the shadow stalkers were gone. The creature allowed herself a moment of rest, panting heavily as she caught her breath. Hansel stirred on her back, his fever making him restless. "So young," he mumbled. "I'm sorry, little sister. I tried to come home." The creature's heart ached at the sadness in his voice. She did not understand his words, but she understood the emotion behind them. This human was afraid he would never see his family again. The creature had felt the same fear when she was separated from her own cubs years ago. She began moving again, driven by a new determination. Hansel had shown kindness to creatures he did not know. He had shared his food and tended to injuries, without asking for anything in return. Now it was her turn to show the same kindness. The third day was the longest. The creature's body was beyond exhaustion, running on pure willpower. Her paws were bloody from the rocky terrain and her muscles cramped with every step, but the human settlement was close now. She could smell the smoke from their fires and hear the distant sounds of their machines. Hansel's condition had grown worse during the night. His breathing was shallow and irregular, and his fever had spiked again. The creature knew that if she did not reach the settlement soon, all her efforts would be in vain. As the sun reached its peak, the creature saw buildings through the trees. The human settlement was just ahead, a collection of metal structures surrounded by a fence. She could see guards walking the perimeter, vehicles moving between the buildings. The creature's legs gave out just as they reached the edge of the settlement. She collapsed to her knees, her body finally overcome by exhaustion. Hansel slid from her back onto the soft grass, still unconscious but breathing. For a moment, the creature could not move. 3 days of constant travel had pushed her beyond her limits. Her vision blurred, and her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. But she had done it. She had brought Hansal to safety. The sound of approaching footsteps made her lift her head. Human soldiers were running toward them, their weapons drawn. The creature knew she should flee, but she had no strength left. She could only lie there and hope that these humans would show Hansal the same. Mercy she had shown him. One of the soldiers was shouting orders, but the creature could not understand the words. All she knew was that Hansal was safe now. A task was complete. Whatever happened to her next, she had kept her promise to protect the strange human who had shown her what true courage looked like. Captain Duhayen was checking the perimeter fence when the commotion started. Shouts echoed across the settlement as his soldiers called out warnings about an approaching threat, grabbed his rifle and ran toward the source of the disturbance. Expecting to find enemy forces or dangerous predators, what he found instead was something that made him stop in his tracks. A massive feline creature lay collapsed at the edge of the forest, her silver fur matted with blood and dirt. On the ground beside her was Lieutenant Hansal, unconscious and clearly injured. "Hold your fire," Duhayen commanded as his soldiers raised their weapons. There was something about the scene that did not fit with an attack. The creature was not threatening them. She was simply lying there, exhausted and hurt. "Sir, that thing is huge," Sergeant Minho said, his voice tight with fear. "It could kill us all if it wanted to." Duhayen studied the creature more carefully. Her flanks were heaving with exhaustion, and her paws were bloody from rough terrain. Most telling of all, she had positioned herself between his soldiers and Hansal. Even though she clearly had no strength left to fight. She's protecting him, Duhayen realized. Look at how she's positioned. She's not threatening us. She's guarding Hansal. The creature's amber eyes tracked Duhayen's movements as he approached slowly. There was intelligence in those eyes and something else. Fear not for herself, but for the human she had carried to safety. She was afraid that these soldiers would hurt Hansal. "It's okay," Duhayen said softly, holding his hands up to show he meant no harm. "We're his friends. We're here to help." The creature's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. She could not understand the words, but she could hear the gentle tone. This human was speaking to her the same way Hansal had spoken to the small animals in the forest. The medical team arrived and began examining Hansal. His fever was dangerously high. The infection in his leg had spread far up his body. Dr. Junkie, the settlement's chief medic, shook his head grimly as he checked the lieutenant's vital signs. "He's in bad shape," the doctor said. "This infection should have killed him days ago. I'm amazed he's still alive." As the medics worked, Duhayen noticed something that made him pause. The creature was injured too. Her paws were cut and bleeding, and there were scratches along her sides where she had squeezed through tight spaces. But these were not the wounds of a predator who had attacked Hansal. These were the injuries of someone who had sacrificed her own comfort to help another. Sir Minho said quietly, "I think this animal carried the lieutenant here. Look at the pattern of her injuries. She's been traveling through rough terrain for days." Duhayen looked more closely at the evidence. The creature's back showed signs of carrying a heavy load, and her exhaustion was the kind that came from days of continuous effort. The pieces began to fall into place. "She saved him," Duhayen said in amazement. "She actually carried him all the way here." Hansal stirred as the medics prepared to move him to the medical facility. His eyes opened briefly, and he saw the soldiers surrounding the creature with their weapons drawn. Despite his weakness, he tried to sit up. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Don't hurt her. She saved me." "Lieutenant, you need to rest," Dr. Junkie said, trying to keep him still. "She carried me," Hansal insisted, his eyes finding the creature. "For 3 days she never stopped. She never left me." The creature heard the distress in Hansal's voice and tried to move closer to him. Her legs would not support her weight, but she dragged herself toward the human who had become so important to her. "Stand down," Duhayen ordered his soldiers. "Lower your weapons. This creature is not our enemy." The soldiers hesitated, but they obeyed. The creature sensed the change in the atmosphere and relaxed slightly. These humans were not going to hurt her or Han-Sol. As the medics carried Hansal toward the medical facility, the creature tried to follow. She managed to stand on shaking legs, driven by the need to stay close to the human she had protected.
Ow.
But her exhaustion was too great, and she collapsed again. She's hurt too, Duhayen observed. Doctor, can you treat her? Dr. Junkie looked uncertain. Sir, I'm not a veterinarian. I don't know anything about alien anatomy. She's bleeding, Duhayen said firmly. She's in pain. She just saved one of our people. We owe her the same care we would give to any soldier. The doctor nodded and began examining the creature's injuries. She was wary at first, but she seemed to understand that he was trying to help. Her cuts were deep and her paws were severely damaged from the rocky terrain. It was clear that she had pushed herself far beyond her normal limits. These injuries are consistent with a 3-day journey through the forest, Dr. Junkie said. As he cleaned the creature's wounds, she must have been in constant pain, but she never stopped. Duhayen watched the medical team work on both the creature and Hansol. He had heard stories of animals helping humans, but he had never imagined anything like this. An alien predator had risked her life to save a human she had never met before. What kind of being does something like this? Minho asked quietly. The same kind that shares food with hungry animals, Duhayen replied, thinking of the reports they had received about Hansol's crash site. The same kind that helps others without expecting anything in return? As the hours passed, both patients began to stabilize. Hansol's fever broke, and the antibiotics began to fight the infection in his leg. The creature's wounds were cleaned and bandaged, and she was given pain medication that helped her rest. Duhayen sat between their beds, watching over both the human and the alien who had formed such an unlikely bond. He was beginning to understand that they had witnessed something extraordinary. This was not just a rescue. This was the beginning of a new kind of relationship between species. When Hansol woke up the next morning, the first thing he saw was the creature lying on a bed nearby. Her amber eyes were watching him with the same protective intensity he remembered from the forest. You're still here, he said softly. You're still watching over me. The creature's ears perked up at the sound of his voice. She tried to stand, but Dr. Junkie gently pushed her back down. She hasn't left your side since we brought you in, Duhayen said. Every time we try to move her to a different room, she becomes agitated. I think she's worried about you. Hansol looked at the bandages on the creature's paws and the careful way she held herself. She's hurt because of me. She sacrificed her own safety to save mine, Lieutenant Duhayen said seriously. What you two have done here is going to change everything. This is first contact between our species and theirs, and it started with an act of pure compassion. Hansol reached out slowly toward the creature. She leaned forward carefully, allowing him to touch her head. Her fur was soft, despite its crystalline appearance, and he could feel the warmth of her body beneath it. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you for not giving up on me. The creature pressed her head gently against his hand. She could not speak his language, but she understood the emotion behind his words. They had both learned something important during their journey through the forest. Kindness was not limited by species or biology. It was something that could bridge any gap between different forms of life. As Duhayen watched the interaction between human and alien, he knew that this moment would be remembered for generations. Two beings from different worlds had found common ground in the most basic of all virtues, the willingness to help another living creature in need. 6 months after the rescue, Hansol stood at the edge of the human settlement, his leg finally strong enough to support his weight without pain. Beside him, the creature he had named Nuri stretched in the morning sunlight, her silver fur catching the light like liquid starlight. The name had come to him during his recovery. Nuri meant world in his language. Somehow it seemed perfect for the being who had opened up a new world of possibilities between their species. She had accepted the name readily, seeming to understand that it was a gift of friendship rather than ownership. The delegation from Earth arrives today, Hansol told her. Even though he knew she could not understand most of his words, over the months, they had developed their own form of communication based on gestures, expressions, and the emotional tones of their voices. Nuri's ears twitched at the serious note in his voice. She had learned to read his moods with the same skill she used to track prey in the forest. Today he was nervous but excited. Something important was about to happen. The friendship between human and alien had attracted attention from across the galaxy. Scientists, diplomats, and military leaders all wanted to study the unprecedented bond that had formed between two species. But Hansal and Nuri had refused to be separated, even for research purposes. "Sir," Sergeant Minho called from the communications center, "the transport ship is requesting permission to land." Hansal nodded and made his way to the landing pad, Nuri padding silently beside him. Over the past months, the other soldiers had grown accustomed to her presence. She was no longer seen as a dangerous predator, but as a valued member of their community. The transport ship settled onto the landing pad with a soft hiss of engines. The delegation that emerged was led by Ambassador Unesio, a woman known for her skill in handling delicate first-contact situations. Behind her came a team of scientists and military advisors, all eager to understand the miracle that had occurred on Verdania Prime. "Lieutenant Hansal," the ambassador said formally, "am honored to meet the man who has achieved what many thought impossible." Hansel saluted respectfully, but his attention was focused on Nuri. The creature had tensed at the approach of so many strangers, her protective instincts activated by the potential threat to her human friend. Ambassador Hansal said carefully, "I should warn you that Nuri is very protective. She may not understand that you mean no harm." As if to prove his point, Nuri positioned herself between Hansel and the delegation, her amber eyes fixed on the newcomers with watchful intensity. She was not threatening them, but she was making it clear that they would have to go through her to reach Hansal. "Remarkable," Dr. Kimsu, the expedition xenobiologist, breathed. "The bond between them is clearly bidirectional. She sees him as part of her family unit." Ambassador Unesio approached slowly, her hands visible and unthreatening. "I've studied the reports," she said to Hansel, "but I had to see it for myself." "How did you manage to gain her trust?" "I didn't," Hansel replied honestly. "She chose to trust me. All I did was show her the same kindness I would show any living being." Over the following days, the delegation observed the partnership between Hansal and Nuri with growing amazement. They watched as Nuri helped Hansal with his physical therapy, providing support when his leg grew tired. They saw Hansal brush Nuri's fur with gentle care, removing burrs and tangles that she could not reach herself. Most remarkably, they witnessed the arrival of other members of Nuri's species. Word had spread through the forest about the strange alliance between predator and prey. Curious felines began to appear at the edge of the settlement, drawn by the scent of their kind, living peacefully among the humans. "This is unprecedented," Dr. Kimsu reported to the ambassador. "We're seeing the beginning of interspecies cultural exchange. The other creatures are learning from Nuri's example." The breakthrough came when one of the visiting felines approached Dr. Kimsu while he was working in the settlement's garden. The creature had been watching him tend to injured plants, and something about his gentle care had sparked its interest. There, empathic Dr. Kimsu realized as the creature allowed him to approach. "They can sense our emotional states and moral intentions." That's how Nuri knew Hansel was different from other humans she might have encountered. Ambassador Unesio immediately understood the implications. They're not just intelligent. They're emotionally intelligent. They can judge the character of other beings. This discovery changed everything. The Verdanian wildcats were not just predators who had learned to tolerate humans. They were a species capable of forming genuine friendships based on mutual respect and understanding. Under Hansel and Nuri's guidance, the first interspecies cooperation protocols were established. The wildcats agreed to help protect the human settlement from dangerous predators in exchange for medical care and shared resources. The humans agreed to respect the wildcats' territory and to never hunt them or their prey. But the most important agreement was symbolic. A monument was erected at the site where Hansal had first crashed, marking the place where two species had first learned to trust each other. The inscription was written in both human script and a pattern of crystals that the wildcats could read through touch. It read simply, "Here kindness crossed the stars." Years later, when the first interspecies conservation teams were established, Hansel and Nuri served as the primary ambassadors. They traveled to other worlds, sharing their story and teaching others that the greatest strength lay not in conquest or domination, but in the courage to help those who were different from themselves. Children of both species grew up hearing the tale of the wounded human and the wildcat who carried him to safety. It became a legend that taught the most important lesson of all, that compassion was the universal language that could bridge any gap between different forms of life. Hansal's sister Soyoung eventually joined the diplomatic corps, inspired by her brother's example. She specialized in interspecies medicine, developing treatments that could help both humans and wildcats. Her work saved countless lives and fulfilled her childhood dream of healing others. Nuri lived to see the birth of the first generation of wildcats who grew up alongside humans. These young ones showed none of the fear or suspicion that had once existed between the species. To them, cooperation was natural, and friendship was possible with any being who showed kindness and respect. In the end, the story of Hansel and Nuri became more than just a tale of rescue and survival. It became proof that the universe was filled with possibilities for connection and understanding. Only beings were brave enough to reach across the darkness and offer help to those in need. The monument at the crash site became a place of pilgrimage. For members of both species, visitors would touch the crystal inscription and remember the moment when two strangers from different worlds chose to care for each other rather than fear each other. And in that choice, they had changed the galaxy. Forever, on quiet evenings, when the work of diplomacy was done, Hansel and Nuri would return to the forest where their friendship had begun. They would sit together under the stars, two beings who had discovered that the greatest adventures did not come from exploring new worlds, but from opening their hearts to new possibilities. The Wildwood Feline had observed from a distance then, carried the wounded human for 3 days without rest. In doing so, she had carried both their species toward a future filled with hope, understanding, and the endless potential for friendship across the stars.